Welcome to the Kelly Patrick Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. In today's episode, I am joined by returning guest, one of the more frequently recurring guests in recent episodes. One of my favorite, Jorge Besada, is joining me, I assume, from Florida.
Yeah, that's all. Hi, Kelly. It's great to be on your show again.
Certainly appreciate you coming on. Um, we today are going to talk about a couple different topics. I was going to start with the what I have sensed as being a big division within MAGA. A couple of my buddies, very close people to me, have told me, and who are typically kind of MAGA homers, so they defend anything Trump would ever do. They have told me they're really disappointed with the handling of the Epstein information from Donald Trump. What are your thoughts on the way Donald Trump has handled the Epstein files? We could say.
Yeah, well, very bad. um, I mean, I don't, everybody talks about like Epstein and maybe some child trafficking or, some child stuff with like older adults, right? There's a lot of that, some kind of like pedophile ring or something like that. But I mean, like I myself, from the little I know, like, you know, it's very easy to be like rumors. Like my guess is like maybe the Epstein stuff was like some guy that created this thing to allow very famous people to maybe just have it's like prostitution. I mean, my guess is that this whole thing started out as some guy allowing very rich and powerful people who have a hard time, because of the media or whatever, getting away to have an affair or something. And my guess is that that's kind of like what was going on more. I mean, there's a difference between people who are just trying to do that. Now, could there have been some Mossad? A lot of people are feeling like maybe this was now used by Israeli intelligence, to maybe potentially extort people and so on. Now, if something like that were to happen, I mean, to me, it's very important to realize that an organization like Mossad or even the FBI, that you have 50,000 employees, or through the years, you ultimately have 100,000 people who are a part of it. Now, what percentage of those people can be like malicious and do something on the side or use their influence to make an extra buck, to do something like that? So I think it's important because obviously, this is really like blowing up. So even if there is Mossad or FBI or some secret intelligence involvement, it's very important to realize it doesn't necessarily mean that it was like from the top. I think a few days ago, Naftali Bennett, one of the previous Israeli prime ministers, he said, "Look, guys, I've been a prime minister, for a while. If somebody knew that this thing was run from the top by Mossad, it would be me. And I can tell you that this is not the case, right? But maybe, maybe he's right. Maybe he's right in his own thinking that wait a minute, we're not doing this. But again, Mossad, 50,000 people, so many people connected to it. I mean, from my understanding, I think Ghislaine Maxwell's father was a Mossad agent. I mean, I don't know all the detail, but there seems like some of the people that have done research that there's a lot of connections with a lot of like powerful Jews and that kind of stuff. And so I think that's something important to keep in mind, that even if there is some Mossad connection, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was just some that Mossad is just out there pulling the strings, and the whole thing is just some vast conspiracy of sinister Jews that want to run the whole world. And I think it's important for people to like see it that way. Am I
It,
making sense?
you are making sense. It's an interesting point that you're making there. Why is it important to you to make a point like that?
Well, again, a lot of the chaos that we're seeing, it goes back to Zionism and all these errors. I mean, ultimately, all this grows from identity versus identity misunderstandings, right? We know that the Jews have been mistreated in the past. They were blamed for the Black Plague, for usury, for finance, banking. We talked about this before, like overrepresentation in communism, in the Bolshevik Revolution. Just because people are overrepresented in a movement, it doesn't mean that they plotted the whole thing,
Hmm.
right? We run into this a lot. You have a lot of people that will say, "Oh no, the Jews were behind Bolshevism. They're behind communism. They're behind all these things." And those are like, to me, those are naive errors. Just because people are overly represented somewhere, you can't say that it was part of some grandiose, conspiracy. So the same.
Just because Trotsky and Lenin and a lot of other early Bolsheviks were in fact Jewish
Yeah, but no,
doesn't mean it
not
was.
Lenin though.
Oh,
Lenin was actually 1/4 Jewish.
oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, Lenin was 1/4 Jewish, and I think it was Stalin. One day, Stalin's daughter brought that up to Stalin. You know, I think I read some biography of like Stalin, and then Stalin told her like, oh, look, just like keep quiet about this or something like that. Yeah, so I think Lenin was 1/4 Jewish. Yeah, Trotsky definitely was Jewish.
And there were other early Bolsheviks who were very
Oh yeah, yeah,
percentage of the early Bolsheviks were in fact Jewish. But the point you're making, which I think is a interesting one, is that that doesn't mean that it was some Jewish coordinated conspiracy or something like that.
exactly right. And it is in many ways. A lot of people complain about like Zionist power and all these things, but really Zionist power grows from anti-Jewish fallacies, right? If we didn't have people, if Hitler, You know, if Hitler didn't pass his Nuremberg Code laws that forbade Jews from having government jobs, from marrying Germans, if Hitler didn't have his anti-Jewish fallacies, then he wouldn't have gotten so many people to hate his guts, and eventually spark this world war. So again, anti-Jewish fallacies lead to Zionist power, which then makes its own set of like mistakes, at least the way I see it. So that's why I'm saying that it is important to look at this whole thing, even if it does have Mossad involvement. If there's Mossad involvement, I can definitely see a lot of people go out there and say, oh yeah, you see, behind the scenes, the Jews and Mossad, they just keep plotting the whole thing or whatever. And I would hate to see that, because anyway, you understand the point I'm trying to make. It's a big mess, man.
As a little bit of an advertisement for your writings, you write for LouRockwell.com. Who else do you write for?
Ooh. I mean, I've written like 12 articles for the Mises Institute, and a lot of times, since Lou Rockwell is actually like the founder of the Mises Institute, so usually I'll write an article for the Mises Institute and then I'll send it, to Lou Rockwell, and most of the times, it gets republished. And so yeah, most of those two. Sometimes some articles I've gotten lucky and they've gotten republished elsewhere. I have one article about Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian school. Very important person. That too got republished at the Foundation for Economic Education, which is one of the oldest like free market think tanks. Mises used to like teach there and so on. And it also got picked up by Zero Hedge, which is a free market oriented like news source. I've self-published like some books. You can find them at besada.com, like my last name, besada.com. But yeah.
One comparison or thought that you have discussed a lot that I have enjoyed is kind of the comparison between an ideology such as, let's say, communism versus Zionism, and that there is a lot of similarities between the two. How would you describe that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the proper way to look at these things. They're just ideologies that were ultimately flawed or disastrous, but for understandable reasons, they appealed to many people. And again, we were talking about it earlier, the great interview you had with your wife. You know, she was talking about how her own father was a big believer, right? In the revolution. So, and the same thing happened to me. I too, Cuban, just like your wife, and I grew up in Cuba in a very communist environment. So a lot of people, when they criticize communism, they'll say, oh no, it's just a bunch of evil bad guys and that kind of stuff. And that's a mistake. If people are making mistakes, we're never going to overcome them by just calling them evil, right? If you just call another person evil, well, and they think they're good and they want to share the wealth, and they want to prevent the evil capitalists from hoarding everything, then they're going to have an adversarial relationship. And actually, I mean, I wrote an article about that at Mises.org. It's called like the fight against error, because Mises, in one of his great, he's very well known for having written Human Action. It's like one of his treatises. So he had a section in there called the fight against error, very early in the book. And Mises makes the case that we really have to focus, on the errors, and he's, to me, it's a classic section. He has two paragraphs where one paragraph says we have to focus we cannot be calling others evil. That only leads to quote unquote irreconcilable conflict.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot get too deep into the moral sphere. I mean, of course, we know that there are people, whether they're communist or whatever it is, we know that there are people who knowingly break the rules that they know, you know, according to their own values, are still wrong. So those people are criminals, obviously. But it's different when we're dealing with an ideology. Like there's the legal concept of mens rea. I think it's called guilty mind. That when you commit a crime, you have to know that you're committing a crime. If you do not know that what you're doing is bad, then the legal system has to give you a break, right? So again, so Mises in two consecutive paragraphs. I mean, my friends, I'm always repeating the same stuff. So in one paragraph he says like we cannot get too deep, into the moral sphere and just say other people are evil. And then in the next paragraph, Mises says that we can't call them crazy either. You know,
Mm.
and sadly in today's world, 95% of dialogue ends in these guys are evil or they're crazy.
Would you say Mises was a pacifist?
Hmm. I think he was very much. I think I could call him a pacifist. I mean, I'm sure he believed in like that the role of government was to have an army as well and so on. But Mises was such a profound thinker. He knew that everything came down to a lot of just errors. Actually, in that same section that you bring it up, Mises wouldn't even call like the Nazis like evil. Okay, because Mises was obviously he was in Germany, in Austria. Once the Nazis got into power, soon after the Nazis got into power, he left Austria to go to Switzerland. And during the Second World War, the Nazis were trying to get him. They were specifically trying to get the Swiss government to hand him over, right? And Mises got lucky and he was able to escape, and come to the United States. But Mises, in that same section, he says, look, there are people that want to treat the Nazis by therapeutic means or implying that they're crazy. And Mises is like, no, 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 no. The Nazis are just like anyone else. They simply
Mm.
bought into this ideology that inevitably has to lead them to do the things that they're doing. So, I mean, to me, that is just like, that's how much of a badass you are, right? I mean, you got the Nazis who want to kill you and you're Jewish, and he's like, no, 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 no. These guys, they're just like anyone else. They fool themselves into the wrong idea. I mean, to me, that's about as badass as it gets.
I
So,
follow. When I asked you at the beginning about the Trump handling of the Epstein case, you went into the direction of saying, you want to make sure you kind of avoid certain fallacies when it comes to discussing or verbiage around that type of thing, to be healthy and to be productive for society and good, right? Would that be accurate?
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Do you think Donald Trump looks good right now with the way that he just said, "Oh no, why are you even asking about Epstein?" Do you think is
No,
this is this
no, no. I
the
mean,
worst you've ever seen him?
I think so. He's looking awful, and there's some funny memes saying that. I mean, he expanded. He went to war with Iran. All the libertarians, all the people who were hoping he would prevent another war. He lost those people. Then he lost the people because of the Epstein stuff. He's losing. He's losing his base. It's fracturing the base. I'm really glad to see that Taylor Greene is out there. I mean, she's one of the few ones. Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's also, you know, you know, attacking Trump. And getting with the Epstein file. Obviously, the best one we have, Massey. Is also getting in there. So yeah, I mean, Trump is just really. He's really hitting rock bottom. And let's see how much further he goes. I wouldn't be surprised if Trump is so naive that I mean, I think we're far away from like trying to overturn the First Amendment, but I could totally see him falling for some. The way things are going with the chaos in Israel Palestine, we know that UNRWA. There's some definition of anti-Semitism. I'm sure you've ran into it.
Mhm.
Where some people want to make it that it's anti-Semitic to say that Jews have dual loyalty, or that saying that maybe Israel is an illegitimate state or something like that. But things are getting so bad that I could totally see Trump be like, "Oh yeah, anti-Semitism is running rampant. We need to adopt this definition." So yeah, I mean he's looking awful, right? Yeah, and yeah, and this relates earlier. You asked me about the comparison. About how communism is an ideology that fooled a lot of people, and the same thing applies to Zionism. And again, I want to get back to that because it really is an important way, to look at this. It makes perfect sense. When I put myself in the minds of many Jews, they're trying to escape real persecution. It is true that the Jews were mistreated. So for them to fool themselves into thinking that the solution is to have their own state, you know, where biblically, they had their own lands, it makes sense that this idea, would spread through their minds and do that. But one of the reasons I think is one of the ways that I think it's easy to show how Zionism was an error is the following. Anti-Semitism is a set of fallacies, right? Saying that the Jews, the Black Plague, that they invented communism, that they invented usury, those are intellectual errors. Now, how do you overcome intellectual errors? Through reason and logic and sympathy and
Mm,
understanding, the same way we overcame slavery, we overcame unequal treatment of women, and those kind of things. So, but Zionism didn't do those things. It didn't do anything to understand the fallacies and overcome them through education and reason. What it did was just say, oh, well, the non-Jews are just always going to be irrationally evil for some unknown reason that we cannot figure out. And the only thing we can do is separate ourselves, leave the real humble synagogues and towns where we have co-lived with other people for 1,000 years, to create our own state and coerce everyone else into having a Jewish flag, a Jewish national anthem, and all that stuff. So that does nothing to overcome the fallacies. So the fallacies must remain. And now you have an additional set of reasons to hate the Jews, right? Because everybody there, nobody. There was the famous King Crane Commission at the end of the First World War. The American government went over there and they asked thousands of people, how do you feel about creating a Jewish state here? And that was the one thing that everybody agreed on. We do not want a Jewish state here, you know? So that's it. The fact that anti-Semitism is a set of fallacies that can only be overcome via reason and logic and sympathy and understanding. And Zionism did not take care of that. You know, that's why we are where we are right now. It only led to further polarizations and just good versus evil, and so. But again, it's an error that just like communism has to be seen, that way, and hopefully overcome. That's why we need some Zionist Gorbachevs. We gotta find them. Yeah.
um, you helped bring me to Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro. You suggested I reach out to him for an interview, and I'm very grateful to you for doing so.
Well, thanks.
Um, yeah, not only did I get to interview him twice, but also I've been kind of in contact with him. Actually, yesterday, someone from his organization said they have another rabbi. I'll get to another anti-Zionist rabbi that I will get to interview soon. So I'm really looking forward to that. But I've listened to I've listened to every single one of his podcast episodes, um, and I'll get the name of it here. I need to say the name of it, but I can't think
Yeah.
of it. But but you hear a lot of interesting points in his podcast. Okay, and one of them is that one of the Jewish guys that was on there said that he visited Egypt and he visited some of these areas, and that he actually everything did fine, and the people there said, "Oh, are you Jewish? Yes, I'm Jewish. Are you Zionist? No, I'm not a Zionist. Oh, okay, yeah, we don't have a problem with Jewish people." So I do think that it is a thing that exists, and I do think people in other countries know it. I think the conflation of the two is the fascinating. Of course, the area of expertise for Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, but the conflation of the two is a deliberate move there. But I think a lot of people really already see a difference, or they already know, or they've always known a difference between the two, because there were people living in that area all across the Middle East who were Jewish way before the state of Israel,
Oh
and
yeah.
some of them stayed there, and they didn't participate in the state of Israel, and so people knew that there are Jewish people, that it's the Zionist project that is at least causing, um, I guess we can say causing the trouble in that area.
Yeah. Do you remember the name of the book, The Wagon Wheel something? Uh, I mean, he wrote like a great book, and I mean, obviously, I mean, he's one of my favorites because I really like how he talks about how Zionism hijacked Jewish identity.
Mm.
Right? I mean, I love that concept because it really comes down to identities. And then the Zionists made the mistake of tying their identity and morality, to Zionism, to this idea that there has to be a Jewish state that coerces a Jewish flag and a Jewish national anthem on millions of people. They tied their identity to an error. And sadly, how do we deprogram these people when so many Jews equate criticism of Zionism with, killing them or throwing them into the sea, right? You know,
Oh
and
yeah, no, he says that even the colors of white and blue. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm open to being corrected, but I'm pretty sure I heard Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro saying that the colors of white and blue, which is kind of like the branding for the state of Israel,
mhm,
that it really has nothing to do with Judaism. And certain things they do there is that they're just kind of made up culture. They kind of say that that's what being Jewish is. Really, it didn't exist before the Zionist project introduced
yeah,
them.
yeah. I mean, when you see him talk, sometimes you can really sense like the somewhat, I don't know if to call it like anger or just how appalled he is
I
that
can imagine. I can imagine. Yeah.
that this wonderful religious tradition that has been such an integral part of Western civilization has been destroyed by a bunch of secular atheists. And remember, Theodore Herzl wanted to have the Pope convert all the Jews to Christianity. He really thought that this could be a solution. So to think that a state that is created by this guy now represents your religion. I mean,
In
the
the
real.
current representation of it, Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't even claim to, really practice the religion.
Oh yeah, yeah, Netanyahu. He's
So think of it from Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro's perspective. He's got to think, man, this is a
yeah,
bullshit deal. This is a
yeah,
bullshit deal for Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro. I can see that would be frustrating. I can only imagine.
yeah. It's sacrilege. It's a sin.
Nothing new, I guess, throughout
Yeah, yeah,
humanity, right? There's terms. I guess you could say also maybe blasphemy in a way.
yeah, yeah, yeah. We should have some. We should have a 14th century, trial and like, you know, I mean, I'm just joking, and have Netanyahu tried in like some, religious court or something for the blasphemy he has committed. I mean, I'm joking, of course. I just
Of
want to
course,
understand,
yes.
but yeah, I wonder what the Jewish punishments were back in the day, for like the bad people.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, Jorge, I appreciate you coming on the show. I always get good feedback from people who do listen to the episodes you come on with me. So I think you're a very thoughtful. I would describe you as a very thoughtful person who is dedicated to spreading what I would say is the good word.
No, thank you, and thanks for doing this podcast. I mean, you're really having a lot of great guests. I highly recommend people watch your episode with your wife. A fellow
Mm.
Cuban like myself. There was a lot of enlightening stuff in there, and obviously the episode. I really like how you had the episode with Dalton. The Nazi.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
You know, but it's
What
very.
what did you find interesting about that episode?
Oh, the first thing I'll say is like, I mean, I'm sure just like you, I mean, you and I are both libertarians. We really understand freedom and value freedom of speech and so on. So the first thing that comes to my mind is how much respect I have for Dalton, to have the courage, to just go out there and tell like how he sees it, knowing that what he's saying, could bring him problems and so on. And I mean, that's the first thing, given my understanding of freedom, I don't care what the truth is. What matters is the algorithm, is the fact that we have
Mm.
freedom and the competition of ideas to get us to wherever things are. Whether somebody uses their freedom to make horrible errors, or say hateful things, fine, those are just mistakes that freedom and emerging competition of ideas can easily solve. But the moment we destroy the mechanism, right, by getting the government to coerce one particular solution, or view or whatever, that's awful. And I'm very lucky that I understand freedom really well. So I mean, I admire the guy in many ways, And I remember you too kind of like him. I remember you were talking to your wife and you were saying, I like how he has courage, right? I think you
Okay,
said
yeah,
something like
yeah, yeah. In the episode with her.
that. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned something. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to get you in trouble, but I mean,
No,
I'm sure
that's okay.
we
Yeah,
both
yeah.
appreciate him having the
No,
courage.
I do. I do
Yeah.
appreciate him coming on because I think it's authentic.
Yeah.
I know that I asked him at the end, what would you like to plug? Do you have a social media where you're out trying to, spread this message, trying to give him an opportunity to promote what he wants to promote? He just said follow. He said follow Nick Fuentes. Jorge Basada. I'm sure you're familiar with who is Nick Fuentes.
Yeah.
Who is Nick Fuentes?
To me, he's another American hero.
Okay.
Nick Fuentes is another guy. I mean, I have different views regarding him. I think Nick Fuentes He really understands too how Zionism has totally Zionized. Not only has it Zionized the Jews, and made mistakes regarding their own identity, but of course he has Zionized American Christianity. He has Zionized our government. It has. I mean, the truth is that Bibi is like our Pope in a way. Bibi goes to Congress and he gives a speech and he gets more than one standing ovation per minute. We cannot. I love the new Pope. The new Pope could never get that many ovations in our Congress, and that's just really sad. And it
It's
goes to
bizarre.
show,
It's bizarre.
yeah, it shows the Zionification. The Jews fool themselves, but Nick. I mean, I have my disagreements. Nick is very like. I mean, he wants, from my understanding, I hate to put words in his mouth, but he wants more of like a white country, that kind of thing. He feels like, he's very adamant about his Catholicism. Like he feels like the United States should be some kind of like white Catholic country or something like that. You know, Again, I hate to put words in his mouth, but so I think those are somewhat mistaken. I think he has some racial views as well. Maybe he's one of these people who feels like, having, maybe the white people, since they're the ones that got capitalism first and have all this civilization. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that, because the modern capitalist order came from Europe and the US would
Mm,
have an overrepresentation of white people. They say,
okay.
oh, wait a minute, in order to have civilization, you have to have white people. It's the white people that have, the civilized countries, and then all the other countries have their chaos and whatever. So I don't know how much he buys into that. But anyway, I mean, to me, he's another hero. Again, anyone who's out there using their freedom of speech to say controversial things, I
Sure.
really like him. And I've seen him talk many times about nonviolence, about how, to me, he's a very classy guy. I mean, I like Nick Fuentes. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
He's certainly considered to be controversial. He's. Yeah, I saw he debated. I listened to his entire debate with Dinesh D'Souza.
Hmm. I read one of his books. I should look at that. I'm sure that was interesting.
You read one of whose books?
Dinesh D'Souza's books.
Which one did you read?
Oh, I forgot, but I
I,
distinctly
I read
remember.
his one about socialism. He had a book about socialism. I did read that.
I don't think it was about socialism, but I distinctly remember in his book, he was talking about how different cultures see race, right? And he quoted that for a lot of Muslims, at the time, maybe like in the 800s or the year 1000, like some of these Muslims, they thought that black people got like cooked too much. It's silly, like
Like that's actually what they believed.
it was something like that. I mean, I'm
They were
really
out in
butchering.
the sun too much. They got cooked.
Yeah, like maybe when they're in the womb because it's too hot, they get cooked too much, so they come out a little darker. And he said that the white people that they didn't get cooked enough, and he said like the Muslims, that we got cooked right.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I'm totally butchering the quote, but this was something in his book that just goes to show how people have their own ethnocentrism. How they tend to see themselves maybe as like
Mm.
superior to others. So that's, again, I'm totally butchering the quote, but I do remember in the book he mentioned that perspective of of Arabs at the time, how they saw whites and how they saw blacks and how they saw themselves. So it's just something I remember from the book.
Kind of consistent with the theme of maybe like a nationalism type view politically. Do you think nationalism is a dangerous thing?
I don't think so.
No.
I think, I mean, human beings, we've always been slightly tribal. We have our tribal connections. And I think having a concept of a nation and having some pride on that history and so on, I don't see anything wrong with that. And I think Nick's, I don't see anything wrong with having that concept of a nation and that kind of stuff. Again, if it's tied to a particular race, and then you think that that we're like better than others and we're the only ones that can have civilization, now you start making errors, that do that kind of stuff. But I don't have any problem with like the white nationalists, you know, if they want to have like their own neighborhood, or even if some people want to break away and have their own little white thing. I don't have any problem with that, because I mean, I ultimately know that if the truth is, like, human beings, we're all pretty much the same, and just by interacting and working and traveling and so on, I know that a common culture of tolerance, like what we have in the US, more or less, it'll just emerge. So the people that are very strong about just breaking away on their own, fine, you know break, again, as long as it's done peacefully and you own your land, and all that. So yeah, I have no problem with the nationalist stuff. And
You think that it wouldn't be, you certainly wouldn't be all of any group who chose to do that, probably. Right? You can see where if you're white and it helps you to, intermingle with other races and it's going to help you get work, that would certainly be a good incentive. So maybe a case for the free market.
Yeah, yeah. We let the free market decide this stuff. And my guess is that the free market will decide that over time, people just rather be able to travel anywhere, and live anywhere, But I mean, obviously, we're not there yet. Like, I remember, I mean, this gets into the whole immigration stuff. I mean, did you see the debate between Dave Smith and that other guy that I think Reason? Oh, no, the uh, Mr. Epstein, the Soho Forum. There was a great debate on immigration with Dave Smith and a guy from the Soho Forum. And again, all of this stuff about white nationalism or any kind of nationalism really has a lot to do with immigration and that kind of stuff. And I am not one of these people. I am very much for, like, almost, you could even call it like open borders. But I also understand that we have, times have changed. Things are different. I definitely understand how it would be against the will of Americans living in a little town in Wichita, you know, to suddenly maybe have your town flooded with like
Mm.
500,000 people from India. And I totally understand how, a lot of people look at this immigration stuff. It's like, it's either like my libertarian moral and we just have to stick to that. I am far more pragmatic, when it comes to like immigration. I know that the real world is not run by a perfect little libertarian formula. The real world
Okay.
is way too messy. So I am someone who is like very open to all kinds of things. If tomorrow we go open borders, I'm okay with that too. Because if we had open borders tomorrow, immediately the welfare state would have to end. The welfare state would end. Even the Zionist calamity would have to end, because you get a bunch of people here who are not for paying taxes. The 1.5 trillion that we're spending in military spending. Anyway, we're
Mm.
getting into like all kinds of subjects, but
That's okay. Yeah. No, that's
yeah,
good.
yeah. Because again, the whole immigration thing, I'm very open to a lot of things, but if we just need a better understanding of freedom and economics, that's kind of like my angle. If we got everyone to understand freedom and economics, then we wouldn't have all these problems. That's the Misesian answer. That's what Mises was about. Getting people to understand economics.
Well, Jorge Basada, thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate you every time.
All right, thank you. Look forward to seeing you again.
Yes, yes, sir. And of course, thanks to everyone for tuning in. We will have another episode of the Kelly Patrick Show out soon. Thank you.